Thank you so much. It's very good to be with you today. Of course, unable to be with you in person, but happy to participate on this event and share the International Tax Competitiveness Index with you. Again, my name is Daniel Bunn. I am Vice President of Global Projects at the Tax Foundation. Tax Foundation is based in Washington, D.C., and we exist to promote sound tax policy, not only in the U.S., but around the world. And one of the tools that we use to do that is the Tax Competitiveness Index, the International Tax Competitiveness Index. And I'm going to share that with you today, the 2020 results, which were just released today, and also talk a little bit about how Greece ranks in that index and outline some reform options that if Greece were to improve its ranking, identify a few options for that. So first of all, the index generally builds on two principles of tax policy. First of all, neutrality. Taxes distort behavior. We know that from economic evidence for many decades. But what can a tax system do to avoid creating more distortions than necessary? Of eliminating special preferences for different behavior or special penalties for different activities by businesses or individuals. We look at ways that tax systems distort economic decision making, and those that rank well on the index have tax systems that have fewer distortions for economic activity. And secondly, competitiveness. If you have a country with high marginal tax rates on personal income next door to a country with lower marginal tax rates on personal income, you might see outmigration of people who might want to move to that lower tax jurisdiction. Similar with corporate taxes. Tax rates can influence behavior, and we look at how countries design their tax systems, not only on the tax base, but on the tax rate. And we look at 5 areas of taxation. We look at corporate taxes, corporate tax rates, the treatment of business losses, the treatment of business investment costs. We look at individual income taxes, personal tax rates, taxes on capital gains and dividends, whether a tax system is flat or progressive, where higher earning people pay more out of their earnings in taxes. We look at consumption taxes. In most countries, that's a value-added tax, like in Greece. But not all countries have the same design for their VAT system. Some countries have narrower tax bases or more exemptions and complexities that make it hard for businesses to comply with the tax system and can distort, again, the decision-making of consumers, whether one product is taxed at the main rate or a lower rate, and so on. We also look at property taxes, whether the property tax system is efficient in the way that it taxes the capital stock in the system, whether the burden is high or whether there are additional taxes on transferring a property, whether it's a financial transactions tax or things like a wealth tax or a bank tax. And then we also look at the treatment of profits earned overseas. We look at the tax treaty network. We look at the rules for offshore earnings for businesses. Now, one of the interesting things about presenting on a European country is that in Europe, you have both the best and worst tax systems in the OECD. So of the 36 OECD countries, Europe has both high-ranking countries, in fact, the highest-ranking country, Estonia, and the lowest-ranking country, Italy. Estonia has ranked #1 in our index for all 7 years for which we've produced it, because it has a system that is relatively flat, has broad bases for taxes, and it does not penalize business investment. Businesses don't have to pay taxes on their earnings until those earnings are distributed to shareholders. Now, I'm going to share a tool that we have, a web tool that we have for comparing the index results. This is tax-competition.org. This is our main website for the results of the International Tax Competitiveness Index. And I'm going to go through how Greece ranks on the different measures of the international index. Overall, Greece ranks 29th in the index, relatively low, not just in Europe, but overall in the index. Now, that's driven by a few different things, and I'll go through those. On corporate taxes, Greece ranks 22nd, which is a little closer to the middle of the pack. Greece has a corporate tax rate that's just above the OECD average, but it does not allow businesses to fully carry forward business losses, an issue that is particularly important these days with the economy and the state that it is. And also, the treatment of business investment isn't as competitive as in some other jurisdictions. On individual taxes, however, Greece ranks relatively well. Greece ranks in the top 10 at number 8 on individual taxation. It has a relatively low tax burden on labor and particularly low dividend taxes, something that has been that can attract foreign investment and be a benefit to local Greeks. On the consumption tax measure, Greece again ranks relatively poorly at 31st. Now, this consumption tax measure again measures the VAT rate, which Greece has a relatively high VAT rate among OECD countries, and it looks at the VAT base. We measure whether a VAT is collecting or how much of consumption is a VAT actually collecting. And Greece ranks relatively poorly on consumption because it has a narrow tax base for VAT, something that both is a design feature where there are exemptions and special preferences for different consumer goods, but also a challenge for enforcement that I know that the government has been focused on. On property taxes, again, Greece ranks relatively low at 32nd. Greece has a relatively high property tax burden relative to the capital stock, and also this impacts the overall state of property transfers and property changes. And I know that again, this is something that has been a focus of the government for reform opportunities. On international tax rules, Greece ranks 24th with a relatively, again, low ranking on that feature. Now, we have profiles here for the different countries. And again, these are some of the highlights for the Greek system. Some of the strengths, again, the 5% rate on dividends, below the OECD average of nearly 24%. Labor tax complexity is relatively good and below the OECD average. And treatment of profits earned overseas, those rules are relatively modest. Greece has, however, an above average corporate tax rate of 24%, and that has been a number that's been on a relative roller coaster in recent years if you've seen the fluctuations in the corporate income tax recently. Again, companies are severely limited in net operating losses that they can use to offset future profits, and again, something that's particularly important in a time like this. And then at 24%, Greece has one of the highest VAT rates in the OECD on one of the narrowest bases. And back to my slides for a minute, just to highlight those points again, and to transition into thinking about, well, if Greece ranks 29th, what are some options to improve the tax system? So if there's strict limits on loss carryforwards, a relatively high VAT rate, and a narrow tax base, limited deductions for machinery and equipment, but again, benefits of a low tax rate on dividends, what might things look like if Greece were to change some of these factors? And one of the fun things about running the index and having all of the data is that I not only get to play with some of these ideas, I get to see how the rank would change if these were implemented. So if limits on loss carryforwards were removed, if immediate expensing for investments in machinery and equipment were adopted, similar to what the US and Canada have done in recent years and what Australia is pursuing to some extent, and what Greece has done for some green investments, if that was broadened, and then the VAT base was expanded perhaps to the OECD average and the VAT rate brought down, then Greece wouldn't be ranked 29th, it would rank 22nd on the index. Now you may ask, why are some of these changes important for competitiveness? It sounds like the VAT changes, maybe that would affect folks who have low earnings more than other folks. But I think it's worth pointing out that Greece has a minimum income policy, a minimum income support policy that could be used to offset some of the impacts of the VAT changes on lower earners. And with that, I thank you again for the opportunity to present the index. I hope it gives some food for thought and opportunities for discussion. And I'll go ahead and turn it back to the moderator. Thank you.